It started the day my sister Ngozi decided to visit Pastor Nduka, the man everyone in our town couldn't stop talking about. They said he was different from the others, that he could look at you and know everything about your life. People swore he had the power to heal sicknesses and solve problems no doctor or traditional healer could fix. I didn't believe it. But Ngozi was desperate. She had been battling a mysterious illness for months. The doctors couldn't figure it out, and the herbs Mama boiled for her didn't work either. She said she needed a miracle, and Pastor Nduka was her last hope. The church wasn't like I expected. It was just a large hall made of corrugated metal sheets with rows of mismatched plastic chairs. People were crammed in tightly, fanning themselves with their hands because it was so hot. As we walked in, I felt a strange chill crawl up my back. It wasn't from the weather, it was something else, something I couldn't explain. Pastor Nduka stood on a small platform at the front. He was tall and slim, dressed in spotless white robes that seemed to shine even in the dim light. His face was calm, but his eyes, there was something about his eyes. They didn't just look at people, they seemed to look through them, like he could see something hidden deep inside. When it was Ngozi's turn, she squeezed my hand and walked up to the front. I stayed in my seat, my heart pounding as I watched. The pastor didn't ask her any questions. He simply placed his hand on her forehead, closed his eyes, and began to speak. He told her things no one else could have known. He described the day she fell ill in such detail it was like he had been there. He mentioned the red scarf our late mother had given her, the one Ngozi had tied around her waist that day. He even spoke about a dream she'd had the night before, something she hadn't shared with anyone. Ngozi broke down in tears, and the crowd erupted in shouts of praise. But I sat frozen in my seat, staring at him in disbelief. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But as Pastor Nduka moved, I noticed something behind him. A shadow. It wasn't his own, though. It was taller and darker, and it didn't match his movements. It looked like a woman, but there was something wrong about it. The shadow didn't have arms or legs. Instead, it had heads. Snake heads. 17 of them, riding and swaying like they were alive. My chest tightened, and I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The snake heads didn't hiss or make any noise, but I could feel their presence as if they were breathing down my neck. My hands shook, and I gripped the edge of my chair to stop myself from running. Ngozi collapsed onto the floor, trembling. Pastor Nduka raised his hands and shouted something about the power of God. The crowd screamed louder, clapping and chanting in agreement. He told her to rise, and she did, her face glowing with joy. "You are free," he declared, and the people cheered. But I couldn't take my eyes off the shadow. It moved with him, its snake heads flicking their tongues as if tasting the air. And for a moment, one of them turned and looked directly at me. I felt like my heart stopped. It didn't have eyes, but I knew it was staring at me. It was as if it knew I could see it. I wanted to run, to grab Ngozi and leave, but my legs wouldn't move. All I could do was sit there, frozen, as the service continued around me. When it finally ended, Ngozi was full of energy, thanking the pastor over and over again. She said she felt lighter, like a heavy weight had been lifted. But I couldn't speak. I just nodded and followed her out of the church, my eyes darting back to the pastor and his shadow as we left. The snake heads were still there, swaying behind him, and I knew in my heart that what I had seen was no trick of the light. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, replaying everything in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had walked into something far more dangerous than we understood. And the worst part was, I had a terrible sense that whatever that thing was, it hadn't forgotten me. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that what I saw was just my imagination. Maybe it was the heat, the tension of the moment, or even the dim lighting in the church. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I knew what I saw, and I couldn't unsee it. Ngozi, on the other hand, was like a completely different person. She was energetic, happy, and full of life. The mysterious illness that had left her bedridden for months was gone. She kept telling anyone who would listen about Pastor Nduka's miracle. People started showing up at her house, asking her about her experience. Some even begged her to take them to the church. Despite her enthusiasm, I couldn't shake my unease. Every time she mentioned the pastor, my mind went back to that shadow. The way it moved. The way one of the snakeheads turned to look at me. The thought alone sent shivers down my spine. I decided to return to the church on my own. I needed answers. I needed to know what kind of man Pastor Nduka really was and what that thing I saw might be. I arrived early, slipping into the back row before the crowd began to fill the room. This time, I paid closer attention. As the service started, Pastor Nduka took the stage with his usual calm demeanor. The congregation erupted in cheers, calling him a man of God, but I noticed something strange. His eyes darted nervously around the room, as if he were searching for someone or something. When he began to preach, his voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a tension I hadn't noticed before. Then it happened again. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, desperate for help. She explained that her family was on the brink of falling apart, that her husband had left her, and her children were sick. Pastor Nduka smiled, placed his hand on her forehead, and closed his eyes. The crowd fell silent, waiting for him to speak. The shadow appeared. It crept up behind him, emerging slowly, like it was rising out of the ground. My heart raced as I saw the snakeheads again, twisting and writhing in a way that made my stomach turn. This time, they moved more aggressively, flicking their tongues and swaying in unison. I clutched the edge of my seat, frozen with fear. Pastor Nduka began to speak, revealing details about the woman's life that she hadn't shared. He mentioned a small golden bracelet she had lost years ago, the argument she had with her husband the night he left, and even the name of the doctor treating her youngest child. The woman broke down in tears, shouting praises to God. The crowd roared with approval, but I couldn't hear them. All I could focus on was the shadow. One of the snakeheads turned toward the woman. It lowered itself as if it were whispering something into Pastor Nduka's ear. His eyes snapped open, and he smiled faintly. He told the woman to kneel and began praying over her. She collapsed, trembling, and the crowd erupted in cheers. I couldn't take it anymore. I slipped out of the church, my legs shaking as I stumbled down the dirt path toward home. My mind was racing with questions. Who or what was Pastor Nduka? And what was that shadow? Was it helping him? Controlling him? Or was he willingly working with it? That night, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I told Ngozi everything. I described the shadow, the snakeheads, and how they seemed to feed off the people Pastor Nduka prayed for. She listened quietly, her face growing more serious with each word I spoke. When I finished, she shook her head. "You're overthinking this," she said. "What you saw was probably just a trick of the light. Pastor Nduka is a man of God. Look at me. I'm healed because of him." I wanted to argue, but I could see I wasn't going to change her mind. To her, the pastor was a miracle worker, and nothing I said would convince her otherwise. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. Over the next few days, I started to notice strange things happening around town. People who had been to the church began acting different. They were restless, on edge, and some even claimed to have seen things in their dreams, dark shapes, glowing eyes, and whispers that woke them in the middle of the night. One man claimed he woke up to find a snake in his room, but when he tried to kill it, it disappeared into thin air. The more I heard, the more convinced I became that Pastor Nduka wasn't just a fraud. He was something far worse. But what could I do? No one would believe me, and I didn't even fully understand what I was dealing with. One night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I heard a soft tapping on my window. My heart stopped. It was the middle of the night, and no one should have been outside. I got up slowly, my hands trembling as I approached the window. When I pulled back the curtain, there was nothing there. Just darkness. But then I saw it. A faint shadow, barely visible, but unmistakable. It was the shape of a woman with snakes for hair. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow seemed to fade into the night, but I could feel its presence lingering, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. That was when I realized the truth. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just tied to Pastor Nduka. It had noticed me, and now, it was coming for me. The following days were a blur of fear and confusion. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't eat, and barely slept. The image of that shadow at my window haunted me, and no matter how much I tried to push it out of my mind, I felt its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. I avoided the church, even as Ngozi kept going. She didn't notice how distant I'd become, too wrapped up in her newfound energy and the praise she was getting from neighbors who marveled at her recovery. People called her a living testimony, and some even offered her small gifts as thanks for introducing them to Pastor Nduka. But I was too scared to warn her again. What if the shadow didn't just notice me? What if it decided to punish me for interfering? One night, I woke up to a loud thud outside my room. My heart leapt into my throat. I sat up, straining to hear through the silence. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate knock on the front door. I froze, my mind racing. Who would be knocking at this hour? I glanced at the clock, it was just past 2 a.m. For a moment, I considered staying in bed, pretending I hadn't heard it. But something compelled me to move. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was the same force that had been haunting me since the first time I stepped into that church. I grabbed the lantern, lit it, and crept to the door. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it and pulled it open. At first, I saw nothing but the empty street, lit faintly by the moon. Then I looked down. A single snake was coiled on the doorstep. Its scales glistened in the dim light, and its eyes seemed to glow faintly, like embers. It didn't hiss or move. It just stared at me. My breath caught, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern. Before I could react, the snake slithered forward, crossing the threshold into the house. I scrambled backward, but it didn't chase me. Instead, it stopped in the middle of the room, raised its head, and stared at me. Then, with a sickening shimmer, it began to change. The snake's body stretched and shifted, growing taller and more human-like. The glow in its eyes intensified, and I realized with horror that I was looking at the same figure I had seen behind Pastor Nduka. The woman with snake heads. She stood there silently, her presence filling the room with a cold, suffocating energy. Her snake heads swayed and hissed softly, their tongues flicking in and out as if tasting my fear. "You've been watching," she said finally. Her voice was smooth and cold, like water running over stone. You've seen things you shouldn't have. I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, and my legs felt like they would give out at any moment. You think you understand what's happening, she continued, taking a step closer. But you don't. You can't. I shook my head, trying to form words, but all I managed was a weak, trembling whisper. What do you want? The woman smiled, a chilling, unnatural smile that didn't reach her eyes. What I want doesn't concern you, she said. What concerns you is this: stay out of my way. Forget what you've seen, and I will spare you. Her words sent a wave of terror through me, but somewhere deep inside, anger began to bubble up. You're hurting people, I said, my voice shaking but growing stronger. Whatever you are, whatever you're doing with Pastor Nduka, it's wrong. Her smile vanished, and the room seemed to grow colder. One of the snake heads lunged toward me, stopping inches from my face. I flinched, but I held my ground. You dare judge me, she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. You think you know what's right and wrong? I give people what they ask for. Power. Healing. Miracles. They come to me willingly. And what do you take from them? I shot back. What's the cost? Her eyes narrowed, and the snake heads hissed louder. The cost is none of your concern. This is your final warning. Interfere again, and you will regret it. With that, she dissolved into shadow, her form melting into the darkness until nothing was left but silence. I stood there, trembling, as the lantern flickered in my hand. My mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear: I couldn't ignore this any longer. The morning after the encounter, I felt both shaken and determined. The shadow spirit had tried to scare me into silence, but her threats only confirmed what I already suspected: she thrived on secrecy. If I wanted to stop her, I needed to expose her to the light, to the people she was feeding on. The question was, how? Ngozi didn't notice my troubled state. She was preparing to lead a group of neighbors to Pastor Nduka's evening service. It was the perfect opportunity. If the spirit was going to show herself, it would be there, where she fed off the pastor's so-called miracles. As evening approached, I gathered a small notebook and a flashlight. I told Ngozi I would join them for the service, and although she looked surprised, she seemed pleased. Maybe you'll finally see that Pastor Nduka is a true man of God, she said with a hopeful smile. I didn't respond. The church was packed, as usual. People filled the rows, fanning themselves against the heat. I sat near the back, scanning the room for any signs of the shadow. Pastor Nduka entered, greeted by cheers and applause. He looked the same, calm, composed, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously over the crowd, and his hands trembled slightly as he lifted them to quiet the congregation. The service began, and the pastor's voice rang out, steady and commanding. He called people forward one by one, placing his hand on their foreheads, praying, and revealing intimate details of their lives. Each time, the crowd erupted into cheers and shouts of praise. But I wasn't paying attention to the miracles. My eyes were fixed on the space behind him, waiting. And then, just as I had feared, the shadow appeared. It rose slowly, almost lazily, as if it knew it couldn't be stopped. The snake heads swayed and hissed softly, their tongues flicking as they surveyed the room. I clenched my fist, forcing myself to stay calm. This time, I wasn't going to run. This time, I was going to fight back. When the shadow began to move toward a young man standing at the front, I stood up abruptly. Stop! I shouted, my voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent. Every face turned toward me, confused and startled. Pastor Nduka froze, his hand hovering above the young man's head. The shadow paused, its snake heads twisting to look in my direction. "What are you doing?" Pastor Nduka demanded, his voice shaking. "I know what you are," I said, stepping forward. "I know what's really happening here." The crowd murmured, and I could see the confusion and fear in their faces. The shadow spirit hissed, her voice cold and venomous. "You dare to interrupt me again? Look around you," I shouted, ignoring her. "This is not a house of God. This is a trap. Every time he places his hand on you, he's feeding her. She takes pieces of you, your energy, your soul, and leaves you with nothing." The room erupted into chaos. People shouted, some in denial, others demanding answers. Pastor Nduka looked panicked, his calm facade crumbling. "This is nonsense," he shouted. "I am a man of God." "You're a puppet," I shot back. "A puppet for her." The shadow hissed louder, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Enough," she snarled. Her form grew darker, larger, as if she were drawing power from the chaos. "You think you can stop me? You think these people will believe you?" The crowd screamed as the shadow surged forward, her snake heads lunging toward me. I held my ground, gripping the flashlight tightly. "You're nothing without their belief," I said, my voice steady despite my fear. "You thrive in the dark, but you can't survive the light." I flicked on the flashlight and pointed it directly at her. The beam cut through the darkness, striking the center of her form. She screamed, a terrible, ear-splitting sound, and recoiled, her form flickering and writhing as if trying to escape. "Look at her!" I shouted to the crowd. "This is the thing behind your so-called miracles. This is the price you've been paying." The crowd gasped as the shadow became more visible, her snake head thrashing wildly. Some people began to pray, others screamed, but the tide was turning. The truth was out, and the spirit was losing her power. Pastor Nduka fell to his knees, covering his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know it would come to this. I just wanted to help." The shadow turned to him, her voice dripping with fury. "You pathetic fool," she spat. "You thought you could control me. You thought you could use me." With a final, desperate scream, she lunged toward him, but the flashlight's beam caught her again. This time, her form began to dissolve, breaking apart into tendrils of smoke. The snake heads hissed one last time before they vanished completely, leaving only silence. The crowd slowly dispersed, shaken and uncertain. Some people cried, others prayed, and many simply left without saying a word. Pastor Nduka sat on the floor, staring at his hands. He looked like a broken man. Ngozi approached me, tears streaming down her face. "You were right," she whispered. "I didn't want to believe it, but you were right." I hugged her tightly, relief washing over me. "It's over," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. "She's gone." Pastor Nduka left town the next day. He didn't say goodbye, and no one tried to stop him. The church was abandoned, left to crumble and decay. People slowly began to recover, though the scars of what had happened lingered. Looking back, I realized there were important lessons in what had happened. Desperation can make people vulnerable to deception. It's easy to place blind faith in someone or something that promises to solve our problems, but not every solution is from a good source. The moment we stop questioning and seeking the truth, we open ourselves to exploitation. If there's one piece of advice I can leave you with, it's this: always trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, don't ignore it. Evil thrives in secrecy, but the truth has a power of its own. No matter how dark things seem, Standing up to injustice, even when it's terrifying, is the only way to bring light back into the world. Support Deep Dive Africa. Explore our ebook store, payhip.com/Echoes of Africa shop. At Deep Dive Africa, we uncover Africa's untold stories, bold struggles, and rich heritage. Listen, learn, be inspired. Empowering conversations about freedom, identity, and Africa's future. Explore our bookstore. Find powerful reads that educate and inspire at Echoes of Africa shop. Your purchase supports our mission. Stay connected. Facebook.com/DeepDiveAfrica. X, Twitter @DeepFolktales. YouTube.com/@Deep-Dive-Africa. Join the movement. Empower the message.